Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. In this video, we're going to be reacting to some facts about slavery that no one seems to be talking about. This was recommended to me, or rather this production, from Thomas Sowell, I believe his name is, Thomas Sowell, following my reaction to a fellow YouTuber that made a brilliant piece about what we're doing to white people. I thought it was important to react to that one because I felt that as a human race, we can all do better. It doesn't matter where you come from. We all have individual responsibility to do better. And I found that piece absolutely beautiful. But this very one was recommended by somebody that listened to it, and I thought I'll react to this rather. Let's have a look at this. Without any further ado, let's get this party started.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story...
But this is crazy, isn't it? It's crazy because why is nobody else talking about this? Why have a certain group of people been made to believe that they were the ones that were so badly mistreated? Again, racism or slavery itself, because that's where I think we need to go back to. Slavery itself was wrong and should not have happened to anyone, no race, no human being. But it happened to a lot of other race. So how is it possible that one race was able to create this narrative that it only happened to one and every other race have not been able to capture that just as much? Okay.
The story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots during the era of..."
No. But that's misleading then, isn't it? You're not doing anybody any favors by creating a myth for them to live by. It's misleading. And what happens when people are misled? It creates unexplained rage and miscarriages of anger, misappropriation of anger, because, or rather, misplacement of anger, because we absorb ourselves of any responsibility and make it somebody else's fault for why we are not where we are meant to be. That's just wrong.
Of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historians
This is just wrong, isn't it? It's just wrong. It's just wrong because people should not be made to feel that they're less than what they're worth. Slavery was a human problem. It wasn't a black problem. It wasn't a white problem. It was a human problem. And as humans, What we've been able to learn of ourselves is when we get greedy, we do anything, even as far as to selling our own brothers and sisters. That's exactly what's happening right here. People of different race, culture, were selling their own people. And because it was a business, everybody else participated. What are we saying should have happened then? Why are we saying that only certain people are to blame? Why are we not attacking our own kind? Not that I am saying we should, but why are we not attacking our own kind for the evil that we committed to ourselves? From the sounds of it, the Europeans had their own issue that they need to address with their neighbors as well. Just like the Irish were sold, the Irish people had their own issues to take up with their neighbors. And the people that took advantage of this group of people, human beings, corrupt human beings, history has shown that we often take advantage of the most vulnerable in society. When you're dealing in inappropriate materials like DRUG, who are the people that are exploited in those instances? They're the vulnerable people. When you're dealing with children being ABUSE, not the children that have got the best roots that are exploited, but instead the ones that are vulnerable. It happens time and time again. This is just ridiculous. We need to educate ourselves and do better.
Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, Raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
We have hundreds of students worldwide and collectively generating over $1 million in revenue with their online.
It's sad. It's sad because of how little we as a human race seem to understand about slavery. It's sad because of how the systems in place refuses to educate its people about slavery. Because if there's enough education on this topic, I think a lot of the tension that is being caused today would be non-existent. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a few idiots out there that would want to take advantage of people, but that's human nature though, isn't it? That's just human nature. I think. But why don't we want to put the systems in place to educate people? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves when we find out these informations. Who does it benefit? Does it benefit the masses to be less angry? Or does it benefit the system to create a bunch of angry people? I think the latter is the case. I think by creating a system that drips down misinformation and creates a lot of anger, what it does is that it creates people that are unable to hold the system accountable for the things they're not doing, such as making sure that there are appropriate schools in place, there are appropriate healthcare system in place, there are proper infrastructures like electricity and power, appropriate communication system. It helps them to continue to redirect those anger towards the people. Oh, it's not us that's causing the problem, it's those immigrants. It's not us that is stopping you from having a job. It's those other race of people. If you get rid of those race of people or your neighbor, you're going to have a job. Then that person becomes and feels that they've been had done by because people coming into your space, and all I need to do is get rid of that person, rather than, hold on a second, there are systems in place that are meant to reduce the amount of people that comes into my country or that comes into my space. Or if they do come into my space, there are meant to be systems in place to make sure that they are appropriate educational system, appropriate healthcare, appropriate job provision, so that we can all have an opportunity. How about looking at it like that rather than hating at each other? It is not your neighbor causing your problem. Changing the narrative, I think, is what we need to do, rather than segregating ourselves even more. Slavery ended ages ago, and yet we're still going on about how we need to isolate ourselves. White people feel like they need to defend themselves. Black people feel like they've been wrong done, they've been had done by these people that've got no link to what happened to the ancestors of these people, or those people, or that people. Come on, guys, we can all do better, and we should do better. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about this. I think it's very insightful. I think it's thought provoking. I think you need to be able to get out of your own space to be able to fully accept and recognize how ill-informed a lot of us are. If you like this sort of content, please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll try and bring out more. Until next time, you guys make sure you look after yourself. It has been Kings. Peace. Bye for now.